Obviously, being that the podcast is based on eventful lives, I think it's important to, if you're happy, to start with you. And I think I'd like to sort of delve into what made you become who you are today, and sort of whether growing up had any sort of influence on that, or if you witnessed anything that made you want to decide to help people through counselling. And I noticed something about grief. Obviously, you specialise in grief. I wondered if there was something that you went through that was a major turning point for you that ultimately ended up with you helping people in the way that you do.
Yeah, sure. So I think from kind of late teens, I developed quite an interest in psychology, and I think back then spirituality and self-improvement, mental health, all that kind of stuff. I just had an interest in it. And so I would spend hours like reading and listening to, I mean, back then there wasn't podcasts and there weren't I don't even think YouTube existed. I mean, mobile phones didn't exist.
Yeah.
So it was very much articles and books and things you could, there were kind of, you could listen to kind of interviews and seminars and all that kind of thing, but it was nothing like it is now.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was just, I had kind of two passions at that point. I was really into music and very into psychology. So I think that kind of provided the framework for where I landed up. At 25 years old, my mum was diagnosed with breast cancer, and she passed away 6 months after diagnosis.
Wow.
And then a year later, my dad died of prostate cancer. So I think that was kind of like the beginning. That was the vehicle, for where I ended up career-wise.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that must have been an incredibly tough period of your life.
Yeah.
And a catalyst from, I'm sure, where you are now. That must have been real tough. So is that kind of the catalyst on what made going forward you want to specialise, or at least be more knowledgeable on how to overcome grief?
Well, I think it was grief and also mental health, because the two are kind of joined at the hip, if you like. So very often when I counsel somebody who's gone through loss, it's not, there are other issues going on as well. So maybe they're anxious, or maybe they're depressed, or maybe they have low self-worth or low self-esteem. So very often it's a big umbrella. What I found is, because I had a genuine interest already in mental health and psychology and self-improvement, everything kind of just, went down the path it was supposed to. So for instance, obviously going through what I went through was extremely traumatic and completely, not expected. It was a very, very big shock. So as a result, that kind of began years and years and years of personal therapy. And I think that also sort of elevated my interest, because I could see what these people were doing for me, and that appealed to me.
Okay, so that was going to feed on to where I was going to go with, in terms, I was wondering if you were already sort of either practicing or learning to become a counsellor, and whether that helped in any way through the process of obviously what you went through with your mum and dad, and whether you were better abled because of what you learned sort of on the counselling basis to then go through something like that? Were you perhaps better prepared, or did that lead on to developing more of an interest in wanting, I think that is something that if anyone to go through and to come out sort of either stronger or better prepared on the other side, it's no better way to then want to help someone else through that, or to have the tools to be able to go through that maybe slightly easily. I don't know if that's probably not a word, but yeah, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and this is a big debate in the counselling world, because one sort of category of counsellors believe that you have to experience something to relate to it and to feel that real empathy. Yeah. Whereas another category of counsellors believe that the training they go through enables them to what we call step into the client's what we call frame of reference. So in other words, you're stepping into their world, but keeping one foot in and one foot out, if you like. So in other words, they haven't necessarily experienced what you've experienced, but they almost are taught to empathize. Right. Now, I think both can work. Because in the end, when you're in therapy, it's all about the therapeutic relationship. It's all about how you connect to the therapist, how the therapist connects to you. Personally, I feel that I have a better understanding of loss than maybe a therapist who hasn't gone through it. Yeah. Just for the simple reason that it's indescribable. You can't teach that. You can't learn it from a book. You can't learn it from theory, because a lot of what a therapist, the journey the therapist goes on to become qualified is a big part of it is theory. So you have to immerse yourself in the theory that psychologists in the 50s came up with. Yeah. Whereas when I see someone grieving, I know what they're going through. So it's just interesting you said that, because I think it's a big debate going on.
And as soon as you said that, actually, sparks went on in my mind slightly. I would tend to agree. Obviously not trained, but if I was looking for someone to aid me through some form of trauma that I'd been through, whether that be, for example, bullying or loss or anything, it would much put my mind at ease to have someone who's helping me through it that has got to the other side themselves, and then got to the other side and decided, actually, I want to help people who are going through that, to have a roadmap on how to go through that and come out the other side. Maybe perhaps a lot better and more well-equipped than they did at the time they went through it. And I think when you say that, it's important, I think. But I agree, there's always a big debate on, actually, I'm sure there might be, but I'm sure there's not enough pool of counsellors that have been through every certain avenue of, what could potentially lead someone to needing therapy or counselling. And so there has to be people that are taught on how to empathise and bring themselves into any form of trauma. So I get it's a difficult argument, I think, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but I do agree with the fact that if I'm looking for someone to aid me through a loss, it's someone who's got to the other side and has to turn around and decided to help people through that.
Sure.
I think, when you say it, I think I'm like, actually that's more powerful to me. So that is interesting. So yeah, I would agree. I would think that is there a point in which we overprescribe therapy and counselling, would you say?
That's a good question. I think that therapy is not for everybody. I think so it's all about the impact it has on your life. So if you get worried and you get concerned and you get anxious about things, I mean, that's normal. Fear is a normal emotion. It's what we call a primary emotion. If you didn't have fear, then you'd go and touch a burning hot stove, or you'd go and step out into the traffic, or, you need fear, right?
Yeah.
The only time when maybe it's useful to get some professional help is looking at how the fear is impacting your life. So if you're at the point where you just become anxious about everything, or where anxiety is having such an effect on your life that it stops you doing things, or drastically minimizes what you do. So for an example, social anxiety is a real thing now, has been for a number of years. So as a result, if someone is really socially anxious, they'll go out less, or they won't go out at all. So to me, that's having a major impact on that person's life. Same with depression. Depression, you have three kind of classifications of depression. You have severe, clinical, what we call clinical, where you're bedridden, you can't get out of bed. Then you have moderate, then you have mild. So someone with moderate depression can still lead a very functional life. But if you can't get out of bed, or even brushing your teeth or having a shower is impossible, well, now it's having an impact. This is really impacting your life. But, I know of a lot of high-functioning CEOs who have depression, right? But they're still running big organizations, and they're still leading a functional life. So it's all about context, and it's all about how it's affecting your day-to-day life.
Yeah, true. And in terms of sort of needing fear, and is there an also saying where you also need some anxiety, because that leads on to some of the core memories that you have? For example, I don't know, first kiss with a partner, for example, you are probably anxious all the way leading up, in your head rolling through, is this the right time? Are the signals there? Is it first, second, third date? And that then leads on to that being more of a core memory because of how anxious you were before that moment. And so we need anxiety as well in just general life to create core memories like that, really. I think a lot of people will probably remember their job interview because leading up to it, all the research you were doing and things like that, and what they were going to ask you, etc. And you remember the job interview a lot more than you probably remember the people themselves. Is that, in your experience, true?
So I think it's very important to distinguish the difference between anxiety and fear. So anxiety is the irrational part of fear.
Right.
So for instance, if someone has health anxiety or severe health anxiety, when they get a headache, they might start having thoughts such as, could this be a brain tumor?
Right.
And then as a result of that, they're Googling the symptoms of migraines or headaches. Right? And that's a rabbit hole. So I think, again, going back to the impact on your life, one has to assess how much this is affecting me. So there is a difference between anxiety and fear. Fear, what's interesting is that even though we've evolved quite drastically since 50,000 years ago, whenever man and woman was first around, the brain hasn't really changed that much.
No.
So, back then it was, I've got to protect myself against a predator, or if I don't go out and hunt something, then we're not going to eat, right? So and today, the only difference between that kind of fear back then and now it's fear orientated towards the 21st century. So, am I going to pay my mortgage, and is my partner still in love with me? But fast forward, but the brain hasn't really changed. So, I think sort of going back to your question, it's important to identify the difference between anxiety and fear.
Yeah, absolutely. And are there any, or what are, if you know them, the key differences between someone who can go through traumatic events and be okay the other side, and someone who it affects and impacts really deeply? Are there any key elements or makeups of someone who can deal with grief and loss or extreme traumatic events on their own and get through that, to someone who may need assistance and help to get to the other side?
Again, it all depends on how it's impacting you. So, for instance, if you're having PTSD every day, or even 2 or 3 times a week, and you're having these intense flashbacks where you're reliving your trauma, you need help.
Yeah.
You need help, because what's happened is, let's say you're 50 years old and the trauma happened when you were 20 years old. If you're still experiencing flashbacks of when you were 20, that means you haven't really left your 20s. You're still carrying around that 20-year-old trauma. So again, it's looking at the impact. If, for instance, every so often you feel that kind of that pain and that sorrow and that sadness or guilt or whatever it is, and then you move through it every once in a while. I mean, again, I would suggest that that's what grief is.
Yeah.
Or whatever you've gone through in your life. There's a conversation about, should we be more resilient? Should we be tougher? Should we work through our problems by ourselves? Or, should we just kind of try and pull upon our own resources? I do have time for that kind of debate. I think there are constructive elements to it.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is, first of all, let's define the trauma. Let's define what the trauma is. Let's define when it happened.
Yeah.
So, as an example, I also think that trauma is a really overused word. So, I think I heard a few months ago someone said, my kid didn't get their usual Marmite sandwich and they were traumatized. Right? Well, that's you're not traumatized.
No.
That's just, that sucks. I didn't get the sandwich I was expecting.
Yeah.
Right? But it's a really overused word. Just like anxiety is a very overused word. OCD is a very overused word. So, you're so OCD. No, you're not so OCD. OCD is a very serious mental health disorder.
Yeah.
So I think that's the first thing, is just establish the context. Okay, well, tell me about the trauma. What did you actually experience? A lot of people have gone through serious stuff. So, I would suggest that if someone has gone through a serious trauma, especially as a kid, and if they didn't get help, I would suggest they need help.
Right.
For the simple reason that, if you're a 10-year-old or you're a 5-year-old, you don't know how to process trauma. You haven't got the emotional intelligence. Your brain doesn't even form properly till you're 25, 30 years old.
No.
Right? So how can you possibly process trauma at such a young age? So I think, again, when did you experience this? But then there are people who go through traumatic stuff, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. I mean,
yeah,
right up to whenever. So and it can still really affect you.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think just addressing those kind of components is also important.
Following from that, would you say a lot of, in that case, you're more able to deal with traumatic events or anything that may lead you to needing help when you're older? Are you more capable of getting through that than when you're younger? And my next sort of alongside that question is, are a lot of people in your experience or in general needing help later on in life because of something they went through when they were younger?
Well, I think a good example would be anger and depression. Right. So if someone comes to me depressed, the first thing we talk about is childhood and growing up.
Yep.
So what happens a lot is that if someone's depressed, they possibly have anger issues as well. They have rage. And so the question is, did the anger get expressed?
Right.
So if it didn't get expressed, which most of the time someone with depression didn't express, then what happens is the anger internalizes.
Yeah.
So now, rather than be angry at the world or angry at others, which is what you needed to do, you're now angry at yourself. You're directing the anger inwards.
Yes.
And essentially, unexpressed anger is now anger directed at you. Right. So that manifests as depression later on in life because there is this inability to express your authenticity. So I would say that I've definitely seen quite a lot. In the end, I mean, anger is a protective mechanism. So, you get angry or you get anxious because you perceive there to be a threat of some sort. That threat could be the feeling of aloneness.
Yeah.
That threat could be feeling unvalued, rejected. It's wounds that we carry from the past. So in answer to your question as to whether one is better equipped in later life, not necessarily. I think a lot depends on so much. I mean, the most important relationship you have is the first relationship you have with normally your parents, right?
Yeah.
But if it's not parents, then it'll be grandparents or carers or teachers. So, a lot of what a counsellor studies is attachment, the theory of attachment, and how it's shaped your life and the roadmap it's created.
Yeah.
So it's looking at those early relationships and the dynamics of those relationships, and not only between yourself and your carers, but also yourself and your peers, your friendship groups, how you related to others. All this has a massive impact on your later life.
Right. Okay. And so would you say, because I've certainly noticed just in general, and I could be completely wrong, is there, first of all, is there a spike in people with mental illness? I was speaking to a friend the other day who said she's got a friend of a friend or a friend, not a friend of but a friend of a friend who doesn't drive because she has anxiety. And I don't remember when once upon a time there was as much, or, is it more common now to have people with mental illness, and why do you think that is, if you do?
So, without appearing too morbid, we have a mental health pandemic.
Yeah.
And, the whole COVID lockdown period, which lasted 2 years, has exacerbated, it's made 10 times worse, this mental health pandemic. And if anything, that period has definitely is definitely going to create huge mental health problems going forward. Just seeing so many kind of young kids pretty much being left by the wayside was just tragic. And it got to the point where I'd be having a conversation with a kid in 16, 17, 18, and they'd say to me, I've forgotten how to talk to someone. I've forgotten how to have conversations because nothing's happening in our lives. We're just at a standstill. So all that has a deeply psychological impact. I think the other thing as well is technology. So a very interesting statistic. Since 2005, which coincidentally is when smartphones came out, mental illness has gone through the roof.
Right.
Anxiety has gone through the roof. Depression's gone through the roof. Suicide rates amongst teenagers have gone through the roof. Reason being that this whole kind of thing about social media is an illusion. It's if anything, it's anti-social media.
Yeah.
Because you're not having conversations anymore. You're now talking through a phone.
True.
Yeah.
I also don't think we use social media in the way that it was initially ever intended. I remember the premise of Facebook, and it was designed so that you could connect with people from your primary school and connect with those people that you've since lost touch with, and you'd search their name and see if they're on Facebook. And now it's all about, I can't remember what they call it, but 5-second or even 2-second content that we're just scrolling through. And I think it's become less of, I don't really do the whole social media thing, but if I do open up Facebook and I end up clicking on a reel or a short form bit of content, not one of those bits of content is one of my friends. It's some random, in my case with my algorithm, it's some random guy doing mechanics on his car or building something, and I would never reach to Facebook or any of the social medias really to connect with my friends, bar maybe Instagram for the Instagram stories, or it's mainly WhatsApp, or like me and my best friend, we'll just call each other, and we may not, we're very busy now, we're older, we may not get each other straight away, but he'll ring back or I'll ring back, and then we speak to each other, talk about everything. And then the odd text is like the odd bit of info that you may need about upcoming things. So would you say that it's now exacerbated because of this short form content rage of actually, we're now having attention spans of next to nothing, because if the content doesn't grab you in those first 2 seconds, it's scroll to the next one until you get that dopamine hit of a great bit of content, for example, which I think now is few and far between to what is, I like the term, I do quite like the term, but they call it brain rot. And a lot of content is just crap, to be honest. So would you say that has exacerbated, and again, I don't think I can overly comment on this, because I know that when we were younger, we were using it more, like Snapchat, for example. That came out when I was sort of early secondary school, maybe. And Snapchat was great. We'd all use it to message our friends, and we'd keep more in contact, whereas now you're older, or certainly now I'm older, it's more we call each other, we either see each other or we just text. So would you say that's exacerbated it?
So there's a few things. So the first thing I would say is that it's not all bad.
No.
So, the fact that you can obtain a piece of information in a second, that's amazing, right?
Yeah.
So there are good things. The fact that I can call a relative thousands of miles away is amazing. Or text. So like anything, it's never black and white.
No.
But what I do a lot is whenever there's an alarming change in anything, it's always right. What's been going on? How has that change been affected? And it can't just be a coincidence that mental illness has gone through the roof since 2005. Right? So you have to look at the whys, and you have to look at, I wonder why that is. So, but just to clarify that it's not all doom and gloom, that there are positives. Well, I mean, just to give you an example, you know, how often have you kind of been in a pub or a restaurant and you've glanced over a table and there's 5 or 6 kids and they're all on their phones, right? Or, you know, I've been to some beautiful places around the world, and when I see people watching the sunset, they're watching through their phone. They're not actually watching the sunset. So I do wonder what people are missing out on. Are they actually missing out on the moment itself? Or are they viewing it through a lens now? And the reason why that causes a problem is that, you know, and it could be one of the reasons why there's such an anxiety epidemic now, is anxiousness is all steeped in the future. It's all the main component of it is futuristic thinking, right? You know, what if this happens? What if that happens? You know, how am I going to get through this? And I need to know this is going to be X, Y, Z, right? Well, that's all futuristic thinking. So your mind is in that kind of futuristic loop. So why is that? Well, that's because you're not present. That's because you're not truly in the moment. Now, with phones, it's very hard to be in the moment because you're constantly scrolling, or you're viewing life or anything external to you through this photo lens, right? So how can you be present? So going back to the sunset, how can you be present with that sunset when you're videoing it, right? So that's just one example. But so, like I said, I think what's really interesting is the people that created phones in the first place, they actually don't let their kids have a phone until they're like 15, 16, not 10, 11, 12. So that's interesting. Well, why is that? Right. So there's all these kind of things. But yeah, it's never black and white. There are positives.
I'd like to know, slight off topic, but I'd like to know a study on how many people who filmed that sunset, for example, actually go back and watch the video. Because I've filmed things, even cool things that have happened sporadically, like we had a training exercise for the Coast Guards while we were on our ferry across the channel. And they dropped from helicopter onto the ferry and they were like practicing, and like, oh, this is wild. So of course, I think filming that is a little bit different because that was like, I've not seen that before. I don't think you'll ever see that again. But even that's really cool. I think I showed probably 2 people like, look at this training exercise. Whereas I don't think if I film, for example, firework night, I don't think I'm really going to show people that because most of us go and watch fireworks. So we've all seen our own fireworks and it's all going to be as good as each other's. But like you say, you go to a firework evening and all you can see is just screens, just filming fireworks. And I'd love to know how many people who record the fireworks watch that video ever.
I'd say 0.
Probably.
Yeah.
So I do find that interesting.
If you asked a mate, how long could you be without your phone? I mean, if I said to you, put your phone away for a week, it'd be hard, right?
I like to put a slight spin on this because I could do it for every reason aside from the fact that there's always something, and it might not be social media, it might not be whipping it out to take a photo, or I just think they've made it tailors to every single need. So for example, Megan and I were in the Lake District very recently, and we were climbing up fells and didn't use our phones at all. Okay, so we went up and down, didn't use phones, maybe took a couple of photos at the top together just to signify the moment. And then climbed down, and it wasn't until the way down we were like, where are we? And it's that moment that you're like, actually, so I could have done the whole experience with no phone, but it's coming down and thinking, oh God. Okay, you could argue you could replace that and have a map, but it's very convenient to have all-in-one device that tells you exactly where you are on that fell and how to get back onto the path, or an SOS device if Megan or I was to fall and injure yourselves. So it's hard now because we've made it such a customary to everything in our lives. And I think AI has only exacerbated that, because I'm guilty of I use AI a lot for a lot of things now, just because it makes so many things easier. Interestingly enough, you talk about people Googling symptoms, what they have sort of headache wise and things like that. What I use AI quite a lot for is research, because it will take, quite often actually it gives you its source websites where it's got all the information from, but it takes the need of going and scrolling Google and clicking on 5 different websites to obtain information from just one website. It will take it all and collate it into this big text that you read, and you've very quickly got to the answer that you're looking for. So I think, I think for most of us, it would be very difficult to go a week without our phones. But I would argue I personally could, but there are those times where you get lost climbing down a fell and you're like, damn.
I think, I hear what you're saying. I think it's thinking about the addictive nature of it. So if it was possible to be disciplined with your phone, in other words, you go on your phone when you need it, so you're lost, you're in the middle of the Lake District and you can't find your way out, let's go on the phone. The problem is that the majority of people, because of the addictive nature of the phone, so you'll find that the kid will come home from school and the parent's on his phone and he'll say, look, just one minute, I'm just doing something. And that doing something takes 3 hours because he's trying to sort out an email or he's trying to do something on his phone. Right? So it's, if you have the ability to say, right, I'm just going to get this done quickly, and then that phone is going in the other room. The problem is most of us don't have that ability. If we did, it'd be fine. But I see it all the time. You could be on some beach and everyone's on their phone, right? And the kid wants to play with you, right? And you're on you're texting, so
you're not present.
Yeah, you're not there, and because it's providing that dopamine hit. Every time you go on your phone, you're giving your brain that dopamine that it wants. I mean, I've lost count of how many times, I've gone on my phone and 7 hours later, I look up and the day's gone. Right? There's a very addictive element to it. So it's just, I hear what you're saying, but these phones were designed the way they are for a reason.
Yeah,
and it's to keep you, it's to keep you buying, and it's to keep you hooked, and it's to keep you attached to it. How many times have you come back from somewhere and you get a ping on your phone, and a lot of people, they're kind of a slave to their work. They get an email, a work email at 9 o'clock at night, and theoretically they should ignore it, but they don't, because it's too compelling. They have to know what's behind that email. So it becomes a compulsion now. Now it's an urge. I've got to open that email and find out who it's from, or what the content is. You know, why is my boss emailing me at 9 p.m. at night? What do they want? Have I still got my job? So again, that creates anxiety. You know, that starts the anxiety thing off. So it's just putting things in context. But you know, I'm not saying that they're all bad. There's plenty of good, but it's being disciplined.
Yeah, I agree. I think interestingly you say about the looking around in a restaurant and actually seeing all the kids on their phones, but interestingly I notice it more with couples. I see a lot of couples on their phones and they're opposite each other at a table, and I think sometimes that's your one time a week where you are together. And I think the difference, okay, at home on the sofa, look at your phone, but going out for a meal, which should signify a special occasion, and I see you look around and you do see a lot of couples on their phones. I'd like to know, it came up, I think on Friday, completely kind of on topic, but kind of off topic, that relationships and marriage mean a lot less than what they did once upon a time. And I can't really work out why, but I'd like to sort of see your take on why you think that is, and why I think personally it's become more disposable and it's not something that's worked at like it perhaps once was.
And actually, going back to the phone example, if you're sitting at the table with your partner and they're on their phone, they're sending you a message, and the message is, this email or this text or this friend is more important than you.
Yeah.
Okay, so now how does that make me feel? How does that make me feel about myself? How are you making me feel about myself, right? You making me feel less valued? You know, where do I fit into this hierarchy? Am I third down the list, fifth down the list, second? So again, that's why, I mean, there's like a 40-50% divorce rate now across the globe.
Wow.
Right, yeah. So again, is that random? I don't know. But again, you have to look at what's happened over the last 30, 40, 50 years to create that trend. Why is it going through why is divorce going through the roof? Well, you know, again, something I see all the time, even when I'm counseling couples, when we're actually in a counseling session, I often see one glancing over their phone, or one picks up their phone and starts texting, and we're actually in a session.
Wow.
Right? So again, what that conveys and what that projects out is you're not really, you know, as valued as what I'm doing right now. And that's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a problem. I think going back to relationships, obviously it's a long conversation, but I think one thing that comes to mind is that what I see a lot of couples not doing is having those serious conversations. Because I think to a certain degree, we kind of sold this whole Disney idea of riding off into the sunset on the white horse, or whatever color horse is your preference. And is life like that? Probably not.
No.
So, yeah, I need to know whether you're a sociable person. I need to know whether you like travel. I need to know if you want kids. I need to know, you know, what do you want from life? Are you looking to do things with your life, or are you just, you know,
happy?
Yeah. So, and also how one person is in a relationship affects the whole relationship. If one person's depressed, the whole relationship is going to absorb that depression. If one person has a lot of anger, it's going to, you know, the whole relationship is going to be susceptible to that anger. So when two people end up together, they've got to go into that relationship healed. Yeah. They've got to go, the starting point has got to be, not having that dependence on the other person to heal them and fix them.
Yeah.
It's really important.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. You've both got to be ready and almost be, not reliant on the other person to patch over wounds or fix you, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and also it is very much, I mean, you can have two people who are incompatible in many things, but they still make it work because just of how they connect with each other. But I still believe conversations do need to be had. It's like very often this whole mind reader thing comes up. So it's like one person is thinking something, but they're not communicating it. So they're expecting their partner to read their minds, right?
Yeah.
So what I always, because I do a lot of couples counselling, so what I often say to people is, look, if you have a need, you have to talk about it, you know. And very often one person will say, well, I just kind of hoped by now they'd know.
Yeah.
And I get that. You know, you want things to come from the heart and you want things to be spontaneous. But, you know, in the end, it is effort. You know, making a relationship work it's work, it's commitment. It's identifying, you know, the needs of the other person, looking at, you know, are you prepared to meet those needs? But I think where we get it wrong a lot is what I can get out of the relationship.
Right.
That's the biggest problem we've got. So it shouldn't be about what I can get. It should be about what I can bring.
Yeah.
What can I bring to the table? And then everything flows from there. Right? But I think what I see a lot is, you know, they don't meet this need, they don't meet that need, they don't meet the other need. And we all have needs, but, you know, well, what are you bringing, right? It's a two-way process. So, I mean, to give you an example, let's say you've got one person who, they do all the washing up, right? Okay, the other person, the partner, doesn't necessarily have to do the equal amount of washing up, but what are they doing?
Right.
So are they, you know, so it's like relationships can work. You don't necessarily have to do the same things, but there has to be balance.
Yeah.
Balance is really important.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Big tangent, but I listened to it again recently, mainly in preparation. There's this trend, or so I've listened to and read, of kids in America, mainly in America, I haven't heard of it so much here, of being prescribed from the age of 7 gender reforming drugs, from going to therapy with having anxiety over certain things, and then obviously that transcribing and going into the realm of changing genders and things like that. Why do you think that that has become a trend, first off? Why do you think we're allowing that, or that there are counsellors and therapists that are going towards that over traditional methods?
I think we're very lost.
I
think we're very lost. It's a search for identity. And, you know, identity is created by how you live your life.
Yeah.
And very often, you know, someone will spend years in and out of therapy. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's like, you know, therapy is 1 hour a week. If you're going every week. And there's another 168 or 167 hours in the week, right? So it's what you're doing in the remaining hours of the week. You can't you can achieve so much in therapy, but there comes a point with, one of the first things I tend to ask people is, tell me about your day. How do you spend your day? What does your day look like? How do you live your life? What do you do? Tell me what makes you tick, right? And the problem is that people are very lost now. They're searching for themselves. They're searching for meaning. They're searching for passion. Like, who am I? And as far as I'm concerned, and it's probably not a very, it's probably not a very contemporary sort of viewpoint, but I'm just wondering if the focus needs to be on what do I need to do to improve the quality of my life? When I always just, technically I'm a counselor, but I'm kind of like 50% coach, 50% counselor. A lot of what I do is trying to give people tools to lead a better life, to live a better quality life. So if someone came to me and said to me, they want to change who they are, what they are, and all the rest of it, I think every case has to be treated individually. But in the end, I would be curious about, what are they really looking for?
Interesting.
What are they really looking for? What's behind this?
And if you got to the point where actually behind it was they were genuinely feeling like they were in the wrong body or the wrong gender, would that be ever something that you recommend? You don't have to answer that, by the way.
It's a very sensitive subject. It's a very controversial subject. Probably not one that I'm qualified to talk about.
No.
I have my own views of it, on it. I suppose look, in the end, of course, there are people born into a female or male body and they want to change their sex. I don't have a problem with, if someone is unhappy in a female body and they want to become a male, who am I? Who am I to judge that? And there is no judgment on my part. But I'm more curious about what's really going on here. Like, so I would rather kind of, I'd like to have conversations about what their challenges are in life, their other challenges are in life, and try and join some dots. How do they feel about themselves? What's their we call it relationship to self. What's your relationship to self? How do you view yourself? How do you view others? What's your relationship with yourself? What's your relationship with others, right? Because all that is integral to why they're feeling the way they're feeling. Okay, well, someone might reply and say, I hate who I am. I have no self-worth. Okay, right, tell me about that. And where does that come from? I mean, so 90% of the time, something has happened in childhood or something has happened growing up, either between parents or grandparents or carers, so it's trying to address, a lot of the time it's this feeling of isolation. So that's a very common feeling. It's feeling isolated and feeling separate from everyone else. That creates the onset of depression. That when you're feeling isolated, that brings on very, very often that brings on depression. So, but then how do we get to that point? That's what I'm curious about. So it's kind of, having conversations about that. But yeah, I mean, generally, if someone is not happy in their own body, then everyone has the right to choose in that respect.
Why would you say it's become it's become what it is? You know, why would you say, because undoubtedly 15, 20 years ago, there were still people that were born feeling like they were born into the wrong gender or the wrong body. Why would you say now that it's become, is it because of social media and sort of we just know more people that go through that? Or is it, why would you say it's more common than it ever has been to go through that kind of transition?
Well, again, look, anxiety and depression and mental illness, it's been around since the year dot, just like cancer has, right? So all these conditions they haven't just appeared, recently. They're, I suppose, before sort of perhaps 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, when more awareness was developed around mental health disorders. I suppose, if someone was anxious in the olden days, they'd be classified as neurotic.
Right.
And so whereas now there's more, awareness because we have diagnostic manuals where we can say, right, let's look at the criteria and what symptoms you're experiencing. But I think it all goes back to what we were talking about before, which is, why is this prevalent now? And I believe that I don't think technology is the only cause, but it is without doubt a big
key factor.
A big factor. Because people are isolating themselves. When if a kid prefers to go home and scroll on their phone all night rather than, have face-to-face interaction with another human being, that's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a real problem. You're not developing social skills. You're not, it's a bit like, talking about couples before. The reason why divorce is going through the roof is because people they're not sharing experiences. When you don't do anything, then what is there to talk about?
Yeah.
Right? It's like you just went on this hiking trip, right? Okay. You've got a few things to talk about there. The views and God, how this made me feel, right? But it's like with these kids who spend the bulk of their life on their phones, there's no interaction with life. There's no interaction with others. And the interaction they have is, in my opinion, it's not functional interaction.
No.
Pressing buttons on the phone, that's not how we were designed to live. Right?
No.
So I think going back to what you were saying, I think technology and phones have played a huge part. I don't think it's the entire story, but I think it's a huge part.
Okay. I do want to circle back slightly because there was a question that I thought about and then I forgot about COVID and the effect that it had, lockdown, and the effect that it had on children. My interesting question was, did you have an idea or a method that would mitigate, or not mitigate necessarily, but dampen the effects that it had on children? And would you say, okay, looking at the phone and not overly interacting through text or something, but in those circumstances where you can't go out and you can't meet other people in social environments, are things like, and I know it's not a good thing, but say, for example, there was a game that was that blew up in popularity over lockdown called Warzone, where you met up with all your friends on there, you'd team up in groups of 4 and you'd drop in. And is that something that's better than your traditional sort of scrolling or texting sort of social media in the way of keeping that interaction and that conversation. Because although, okay, you may say, well, everyone's locked down, so there wasn't the conversation, oh, Toby, what did you do today? Well, not a lot, because we're locked in our house. And okay, you could then argue, yes, in moderation, but sitting on Warzone for 12 hours a day talking to your friends is probably not going to mitigate or help necessarily. But what is your take on if there was a way to not have the issues that we are now seeing after COVID or after lockdown, sorry? Yeah. Is there something that you would have recommended?
So 2020 to 2022 was an unusual time. Like that's an understatement, right?
Yeah.
So to kind of, that is not a kind of guide moving forward in terms of how to live one's life, because it was that was an unprecedented period of for those 2 years. I think some of the things that I think certainly my clients found useful back then were the idea that it's focusing on things that we can control and understanding the things that we can't. That, I think thinking about what the emotions are that come from going through something like that, which is powerlessness and helplessness. You feel helpless. And in the end, you feel helpless because you're in a situation you can't control. If you learn to become aware of that actually this is something I can't control, it can be empowering, because now you become aware of your limitations and what you're able to do and what you can't. And what that propels is the ability to just focus on things you can control, right?
Yeah.
So for that period, I would ask my clients, well, what is within your control at the moment? Well, I'm allowed out on a walk, right? So I can go out on a walk. I mean, myself and my family, we went out every day for a walk because you were allowed to go out for a walk, right?
Yeah.
The weather was pretty great. I think from memory, from March 2020, I think the weather was pretty great.
It was.
Thank goodness.
Yeah.
Otherwise it would have been not such a great experience. But so that's one thing. Okay, well, that's one thing I can do. Something that really exploded was home workouts on YouTube. So this Joe Wicks guy really took off, especially with kids, because kids just didn't know what to do with themselves, right? So I hear a lot of stories of kids that would, jump up and down in front of YouTube to these workouts.
Yeah.
This is all a choice, Joe. So this is all something that is within your control. So I can spend the next hour working out, right? I don't have to. But if I do, I'm going to benefit.
Yeah.
I'm going to benefit because it's going to be good for my mental and physical health. But the most important thing is it's going to provide me focus. It's going to engage my intention on something. The problems start when you have nothing to engage your attention with. Because what happens is, you kind of just want to switch off, and you lose all kind of motivation or desire to do anything. Now we've got a problem, right? So it's thinking about things that you're able to do and realizing that, no, we can't, you're not going to be able to do this at the moment, but you are going to be able to do this. So that was one thing that helped. I think the other thing was the idea that everything passes. That in life, nothing is permanent.
Yeah.
And that is a kind of an idea that comes up all the time. It comes up with loss. It comes up with anxiety. You know, I have clients that they get panic attacks. Well, panic attack is not pleasant, but the average length of a panic attack is 15 to 30 minutes. And so in 15 to 30 minutes, it's going to pass.
Yeah.
Your body is going to reset. So I think a lot of the things that I used to talk about during that time were just some useful principles like that. That, you know, this is not going to be forever. I mean, 2 years is obviously, it was a long time.
Yeah.
And it wasn't constant, you know.
No.
People did resume normality here and there and go back to work and whatever. So even in that context, it wasn't every day for 2 years.
No.
Right? So yeah, I was thinking about sort of healthy choices, positive choices, focusing on those, trying to create structure. Going back to the war games question, look, for that period of time, yes, whatever you can do to just engage in some shape or form, because that does require engagement, probably did serve a purpose at that time.
I think my comment on that was more the social element of it. Obviously, comparing that to going on a walk with your family is you know, there is no comparison. It was more to keep some form of connection, you know, in the way that, I guess, replace the war game with FaceTime, for example, and then also going for a walk. So yeah, it was more the keeping that social element than obviously playing physical game itself.
Absolutely. And like I said, you have to employ the tools that you have at the time, right? And yeah, that's always going to be a better option. But you know, in terms of now, in terms of today, I would rather kids get out,
100%,
and you know, and do something. Only because I just see the effects. I see, you know, there are a lot of kids with mental health issues. That's all. So I have to look at, well, what's going on? You know, so when you start to join the dots and you start to see themes and patterns, they have to be taken seriously.
Yeah. So when I first met you, and even still to this day, you were very big and prominent on exercise and diet. And in your opinion, how important is that within keeping a healthy sort of state of mind?
So what's interesting is that you manage anxiety mainly through what we call cognitive solutions. So anxiety is mainly all up in the head. So it comes from thoughts. So you'll have anxious thoughts, and then that will create the physical feeling of anxiety. Not always, but 90% of the time. So there are times where you just feel it in your body. There's no specific thoughts going on, but you just feel it. That does happen, but the majority of the time, it's like if someone says they're anxious, I'll say, well, what are you anxious about? And then they'll say, I'm anxious about this, that, and the other. Okay, well, you must be thinking about those things then. Right. So the thoughts are synonymous with the anxiety. Depression's a different ballgame. Depression is more about physical solutions. So with depression, if you can't get out of bed, we have to somehow physically get you out of bed. So the first step would be let go of the expectations for the day and just focus on pulling the sheets over you. That's all you need to focus on. Right. So you pull the sheet over you. Okay. What's the next step? The next step is swivel your body around and just sit up. That's all you need to do. That's all you need to focus on. What's the next thing? Okay, well, let's see if we can get to the bathroom. Let's get to the bathroom. Okay, fine. And so it's step by step that kind of idea. So depression is about making yourself do things you don't want to do.
Yeah.
So there's this big argument about, if I say to somebody, go for a walk in nature, they'll say, I'm too depressed to go for a walk in nature, or I haven't got the motivation, or I just don't have it in me. I'm too exhausted, right? So that's all valid, right? But it's a catch-22 because that walk in nature is going to reduce your depression by 20, 30%. Or if I say to somebody, is there any way you can work out for 30 minutes, even if it's just putting a YouTube on, working out for 30 minutes? I can't, I'm exhausted, I'm too depressed. Okay. But what's the alternative? The alternative is you're going to have this exhaustive depression. So then it becomes about a concept called the choice point. The choice point is a strategy that's taken from what we call acceptance and commitment therapeutical approaches. So the choice point is, if I do X, then it's going to produce an outcome. It's going to produce a result, a positive result. But if I do Y, then I'm going to suffer. I'm going to experience the consequences of that. If someone stays on their phone for 6 hours and they also have depression, they're going to be depressed.
Yeah.
If you get yourself out by a lake and you sit in front of the lake for 30 minutes and you go for a walk and you take in the fresh air and you listen to the birds and watch the wind through the trees, your depression is going to go down. I don't care what anyone says, because external and audible stimulation changes the brain chemistry.
Yeah.
So it might not feel like the depression's going down, but it does. Now, I'm not saying it's then going to come back, okay?
Yeah.
But, when you get up, you have X amount of hours in the day. So you, in the end, whether you have depression or whether you don't have depression, you do have a choice how you spend that time.
Yeah.
Now, the person with depression will say, I don't have a choice. I'm too depressed. But there is always a choice.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that the depression is a choice. It's really important to distinguish that. Having depression is not a choice. No one chooses to be depressed, but they can choose to get out of bed.
Yeah. My next question is on, I've had a few friends, one in particular, and they masked their mental illnesses with drugs. Through my experience and through people I've met who have struggled with various addictions, that is quite a common theme. Would you agree? And is there anything that you would say to those people? Because it's a very easy way to numb any form of pain across the board, really. So is there any advice or anything you would say either before going down that route or to anyone who is in that route that is masking, even to the point, even sort of racing thoughts and dealing with forms of ADHD by using things like marijuana to mask or numb those thoughts? Is there anything that you would say to those people?
So when someone has an addiction to, whether it's marijuana, whether it's alcohol, whether it's nicotine, whether it's gambling, cocaine, drugs, prescription drugs, these are what we call in psychology maladaptive behaviors. So in other words, they are behaviors, they are habits, which at the end of the day, they're not healthy, right? But there's a more important question to ask, and that is, is your life working for you? Are you happy? And those are really the important questions. Now, you're absolutely correct that someone engages in an addiction to cover up, normally to cover up pain, right? Whether it's grief, whether it's, hurt, upset, emotional, whatever it is, it's, as you correctly put it, they're masking their suffering. There's various reasons for this. One reason is becomes a habit. You're 15 years old, you're at the pub with your mates, and they kind of egg you on, come on, kind of show us you're a man kind of thing. And then it becomes a habit, right? And then going out drinking with your mates becomes a social ritual. It's a way of connection. Right? And then, it starts off with getting paralytic at the weekends, but weekends only. So very often I'll say to someone, well, how often do you drink? How much do you drink? Oh, it's only the weekend. Right, okay. And then fast forward a few years, well, now it's in the evenings as well. So I have the odd glass of wine. Sometimes, I might have a bottle or whatever. Right? So habits are hard to break. Right? But the first question is whether there was a kind of a need for social integration, for social connection. Because very often someone who has an addiction to alcohol, they did it because they wanted to fit in. Right? That's one example. Another example is someone goes through a tragic loss, perhaps at a young age, and they just don't have the tools to deal with it. And then later on, they discover something, whether it's, say, marijuana, alcohol, whatever is in front of them, and they discover that will take away their pain, and that becomes addictive. They like the fact that they don't have to feel that pain. So I would ask somebody, well, is your life working? And what that question entails is, are you leading a functional life? Right? Again, it's going back to the impact. Very often with marriage counseling that I do, if one person drinks, and let's say they do have an addiction, they might say, well, I drink, but I can handle it, or it's not an issue. I hear that a lot. It's not an issue. And my feeling on that is it's an issue if it's affecting the relationship. So if it's affecting the marriage, it's an issue. If it's affecting how you live your life, it's an issue. But then you have to look at the physical consequences. What are you doing to your body? Right?
Yeah.
You don't have to be, you don't have to be a sort of a rocket scientist to know that that addictions are not good for you physically. Yes, there are people that live to old age who drink, but that's not the norm. The norm is that addictions take their physical toll on your body. So I would be curious, why do you want to put yourself through that? What's that about? But so again, it's looking at the impact and, well, maybe that pain needs to be addressed because you're carrying it around. It's not going anywhere. And how healthy is that?
Yeah. And there's a big need for them, but also can, in some ways, the same be said about a lot of the prescribed medication for those types of mental illnesses? Because I've heard a lot of people go through trials of different prescribed medication for, say, depression or ADHD, and they go through some, and some of them just make them spaced out and almost numb. So could the same be said for some prescribed medication?
Yeah, this is a very big conversation, but to summarize, so counsellors don't prescribe. So I will not prescribe a medication. And generally, we don't like to advise because get into all kinds of legal wrangles. All I would say is this. I've been doing this 30 years. In my experience, ADHD meds and anxiety meds are more successful than depression meds, antidepressants, in my experience.
Right.
I think if someone wants to take an antidepressant, let them take an antidepressant. But the most important question is this: are you benefiting? You know, I've got so many clients who've been taking antidepressants for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And I'll ask them, has it made a difference? And 90% of them will say no, right?
Wow.
So then I'll think, okay, so why do you keep taking them? And they'll say, well, the problem is, if I come off them, I don't know if I'd be worse. Now, that's a very valid statement.
Yeah.
Right. Now, obviously, if you do withdraw from prescribed meds, it has to be done very gradually, and it has to be done under supervision. But they are handed out like sweets. They really are. And the problem I've got with that is that I think that rigorous exercise is probably a better road to go down. That if you've got a choice between an antidepressant or going for a 5-mile hike, I'd rather you do the hike.
Yeah.
For the simple reason that, I mean, the studies they're doing now are reflective of that as well. That actually 30 minutes or 1 hour rigorous exercise or just a walk in nature is as good as an antidepressant. So, you know, am I against them? No, because I think there probably are some people that actually do need them. If someone has acute, severe clinical depression, which is genetic, and they can't get out of bed, one probably needs to think about antidepressants. But I think they're completely overprescribed. They're handing them out like sweets to kids, which, you know, I've got quite strong views about. I think those kids need to be doing other things than taking antidepressants. ADHD is a little bit different. From what I've seen, the medications tend to be more successful. So they tend to make more change than the antidepressants do. And actually, something else that I've seen is that if someone has ADHD or autism and they're taking antidepressants, that can be a problem.
Right.
A bit like if someone has bipolar and they're taking antidepressants, that can be a problem because taking the wrong meds can inhibit the benefits. So it is important, you know, if one wants to be diagnosed, it's important to know what you have in that regard if you're going down that route. But generally, are they helpful? I think for every person they have helped, I think someone else they haven't. So I've got mixed feelings about them, but they have to be used in conjunction with lifestyle changes.
Yeah. And then just to add a little question before my final question, there's been a lot of trials fairly recently and becoming more sort of mainstream with things like LSD and psilocybin and things like that. Have you heard or seen much of that? And I've seen some studies, certainly with soldiers with PTSD, and some LSD trials that have been, and schizophrenia actually, that have been pretty amazing. Would you say that is going towards a good sort of future with those two things, or arguably the similar argument with what we've just said?
Again, I've heard mixed reports. So
Yeah.
I've heard of people who have, like Mexico is a big place where they have quite a few of these clinics. The drugs that have often been talked about have been ibogaine and I forget, ashwagandha, I think it's called. So a lot of those kind of drugs, psilocybin, as you mentioned. And yes, some people have seen some improvement in their mental health. I tell you what I have seen quite a bit is people have gone out there and they've seen improvement, but then they've gone back to where they were. So they've seen an improvement for maybe 3 to 6 months, some with 9 months, and then they've kind of gone back. But then the question is why they've gone back. So, you know, are they still keeping up with regimes which are going to help them? So again, that needs to be addressed. But the only thing if a client of mine said, look, they're seriously thinking about going down that route, then as a responsible counsellor, I would say, look, just do some research, know what you're getting into. You can have a bad experience, right? Because I've heard of people who have had bad experiences. So you've got to kind of, you know, it's like anything. Knowledge is power, right? Some people have bad trips, right? So definition of that would be you go through, you could go, you know, I've known people who have gone through 24-hour, 48-hour psychotic breaks, which is you become a bit mad. You lose all touch with reality and identity. So it can be scary. So all I'm saying is that won't necessarily be your experience, but you have to know it's a bit like, you know, with taking anxiety meds. There are some where they're going to produce side effects. You have to know what those side effects are. You have to know what you're getting into. So all I would say to that, and I'll be diplomatic in my answer, is that it could be a really positive experience. It could also be a harrowing experience. I can't tell you which one it will be. So it's going to involve, you know, it will involve a gamble on your part. But just, you know, go into it fully researched and know what you're getting into. But yes, I think it could be the future. I also think that, you know, the governments are going to be looking to monetize it. And I think the only reason it hasn't sort of taken off in this country is there's obviously this inability to monetize it. And I think there's still got that problem in the States as well, is that it's trying to, you know, get control on a financial basis.
Yeah. And so sliding sort of back onto you and your sort of career, I would imagine some really good sort of breakthroughs and good feelings for you. And your little questionnaire, it was on there. But bringing someone back from extreme sort of mental conditions, like, you know, not wanting to be here anymore, and those sorts of thoughts must be for you an amazing feeling. And I'd say quite. Is there a way that you deal with those sort of? Are there any adverse effects for you for what you do, and how do you deal with that?
So, counsellors are often described as wounded healers.
Yes.
I'd say most counsellors I've come across, most therapists, they've all got struggles. They've all got mental health struggles. But it's part of the reason you get into this business, because number one, when you reduce someone else's suffering, when you sort of help them to heal themselves, because you're not healing them, they're healing themselves, but you're helping them heal themselves. It makes you feel complete. It makes you feel it gives you a warm feeling inside, because we all search for that feeling of completeness. We all search, for that feeling of connection and purpose, right?
Interesting.
And very often, one thinks about the concept of, the idea of serving others. It gets you out of your own head. That when you help others, you're kind of like helping yourself in the process, because you can attain a lot of fulfillment and a lot of satisfaction by doing X, Y, Z in your life, and that can provide a certain degree of fulfillment. When you help someone else, it's different. It's a different feeling. It's almost like, oh, hang on, it's not about me anymore.
Yeah.
And that, that kind of, you're more likely to get that sense of completeness that way than you are. I mean, look at sort of highly successful people who are miserable, right? So people who attain so much in life, whether it's financial, whether it's, whatever they're doing, but they're depressed, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder if it's because it's all about them, that their whole kind of, who is it who said, I think it was Prince who said, he got to the top of the mountain and there was nothing there.
Right.
I love that, because it's almost like you think that attaining heights in your life is going to make you this happy, fulfilled, liberated, awakened person. It might do, but you're more likely to attain that by helping others, I think.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. Yeah, I think I agree. And I think part of the reason maybe is because there's always another mountain. For those kind of people that strive to climb to the top, reach a certain point, there's never, you never reach the top. I think you always climb. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. But I don't think in my experience there's ever been a top where you feel fulfilled to the point of, like you say, helping other people. I think, that feeling must be pretty incredible.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of meaning, you have to install the meaning. People often say, what's the meaning of life? What does it mean to be happy? It's how you define it.
Yeah.
But that requires intention. So for me, if I'm out in nature and I'm just watching the birds, right? I've already created the intention to get something out of that experience, right? So going back to the choice word, I've made that choice. I've made the choice that experience is going to provide me meaning.
Yes.
Right? So a lot of it is about, you have to do a bit of soul searching. You have to you have to kind of explore what meaning means to you, and you have to create it. You have to create your definition of meaning.
Interesting. I like that. So is there anything you'd like to add, first of all? And then my final question that I have is, I think, quite an important one for maybe anyone listening. What's the difference, in your opinion, in a good and a bad therapist and or counsellor? Because I think, yes, I've only had 2, but you've been pretty amazing, and I think your techniques in general are pretty incredible, and I've not experienced that, and through talking to friends who have been through it, not experienced that with them either. So I think, interestingly, what defines a good and a bad, in your opinion, or if there isn't necessarily a bad, but everyone's techniques are going to be different, undoubtedly, and whether that defines, the overall outcome of the issues at hand.
It's very hard to find a good counsellor.
Yeah.
It really is. I say that from personal experience. So for me to be a counsellor, I have to be in therapy constantly. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I've been in therapy for 30 years, different therapists. So, and that journey has been interesting.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Every therapist has to be in therapy.
I presumed that you would probably need to offload to a certain degree, but I didn't know you had to.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So, well, not only from a legal perspective, but also from a moral one.
Yeah.
So my own personal experience of trying to find the right therapists, it's hard. It's really hard. But when you found the right one,
Yeah.
I'd say on average, I've probably seen, in 30 years, 12 maybe, 13 different therapists.
Wow.
And I'd say on average, to find the right person on each occasion, well, the last therapist, I would say I probably spoke to between 6 to 8 different people. If you think about it, you are spending an hour with somebody where you're sharing very private information. You're completely exposing yourself. You're being extremely vulnerable. And it has to be right. It has to be right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So would you say you almost go through kind of a vetting process?
Absolutely. You've got to.
Right.
Now, you might be lucky, because this has happened to me in the past, where the first person you speak to is amazing.
Yeah.
That does happen. It's rare, but it does happen. So there are a few things for me that I notice. So the first thing is there can't be any judgment. So if a client says something to me, I can't convey any kind of judgment whatsoever. Now, if I sense that my therapist is being a little bit judgy, it's a real turn off. And believe it or not, it's rife. There are so many therapists out there who, when you tell them something, you can see the wheels are turning, right? So that's really important. You can't feel judged. The other thing that's really important, which again is very common, is you have to let your client talk. And what I've seen, I've come across a lot of therapists who they're in the session so that they can talk, right? And that's not the way it's supposed to be. The idea is if you don't let your client speak, how can you help them? So that's something else that's really important. You have to be able to give space.
Yeah.
At the same time, you want the right blend of interaction. So if it's just, and again, you have to determine, a good counselor will ask their client, look, do you want to just sit back and me coach you, or do you need to offload? But you don't even need to ask that question, because a good counselor will kind of you'll see very soon into the therapy what the client needs, what that person needs. Some people just literally want to spend an hour talking about their week, and that's fine.
Yeah.
Others really need guidance. They really need some tools. They really need some strategies, which is why I'm pretty much 50% counselor, 50% coach.
Yeah.
Especially with the anxiety, that a lot of the conversations to do with anxiety, a lot of it's coaching. A lot of it's tools, strategies, concepts, ideas.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Is there anything at all you'd like to sort of add?
I've really enjoyed this.
It's been
such a great conversation, and I think it's great what you're doing, and I think you'll really go places. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. No, I think it's interesting when you get the headphones on. It just takes you out of that normal environment, and I always find my first two questions in my own head, I panic, and then once you start to sort of just get through a couple of questions, you settle in, and it just becomes quite this, and then the ideas turn and the light bulb goes off, and it's it's good fun. I could have probably sat here for a long time.
Do you know what? Easily. Wife and kids, waiting. But,
no.
I think I'd have no problem doing this again with you.
Oh, lovely.
And maybe, with no limits on the time, because I think we could talk for hours.
Yeah. Lovely stuff. Well, we'll hopefully one day get that in the diary, and just waiting on my intro now, and we'll be live.
Amazing.
So I cannot wait, because the initial response, like what you just said, has been fantastic.
I'm really pleased.
I'm excited.
It's got a great setup here as well.
It's it all means something, and it's as once I sort of do a bit more saving, it's only going to mean more. Behind you, there will be a shelf with some memorable items from my childhood and from grandparents that have given me things along the way that I've kept. That wall, for example, my granddad helped put all of those planks of wood up on an old barn of ours.
So cool.
And I've repurposed it for in here.
Yeah. I love the wood. I love this.
Yeah.
This is just...
I made the table.
Wow.
It does need a tighten because it's obviously with the heat, it's warped slightly. But yeah, it's actually 5 sleepers.
Wow.
All drilled through, and then I got threaded bar all the way through, and then tightened it up with
You're
bolts.
very talented. You really are.
Thank you.
Very talented.
So yeah, thank you for
I've really enjoyed it.
spending the time and coming on.
No, absolutely.